Hello, thank you for joining us at this EnQueer panel. We'll be discussing today queer coding and decoding with my four fellow panelists. So my name is Adrik Kemp, and I am a writer and lyricist, and I am very excited to be talking today about queer coding and queer decoding and all of the little nuances in between. Joining me on the panel, I have Flick Martin. Would you like to say hello?
Hello.
I have Andi Buchanan.
Hi.
JL Heylen.
G'day.
And Rem Wigmore.
Hello.
And we're going to be dissecting what queer coding is, and how to decode it. We'll also be looking at it in a context of science fiction, horror, and genre fiction, and trying to figure out how to move forward in our new, very exciting times. So I think we should kick off. So for everyone out there, I thought I would first just very briefly talk about what queer coding is and where it comes from. I suppose the easiest way to explain it is through movies and Hollywood, and something called the Hays Code, which was enacted in the 1930s in order to stop perverse content being shown in movies. And that included a whole host of things, but also homosexuality. And because of that censorship, it meant that characters were developed who, instead of being overtly queer, were given characteristics of queer people and therefore coded as queer. And that's what we call queer coding. Obviously, that can also extend into literature, into music, into all different kinds of genres. And we'll be unpacking mostly on the literary side today, but also thinking about it in terms of movies and adaptations and all of that sort of stuff. So before we sort of get started, I thought I would ask you guys to maybe tell me a little bit about what codes a person as queer when you're reading or when you're watching or when you're writing. So Rem, did you want to kick us off? Or throw it to someone else?
I'll throw it to someone else just because this wasn't in the worksheet and I didn't do my homework.
Well, Flick?
Yeah, I don't really know. Like it's almost like that thing of like just what was it that they said about porn? It's like I don't have a strict definition for it, but I know it when I see it, and it kind of feels like that, you know.
I suppose the most general way of looking at it is thinking about gay men and lesbians, and if a gay man is being coded that way, without being said, he might be more effeminate. And if a woman is being coded that way, she might be more masculine. And that would be the most basic way to sort of look at it. Would you agree?
Yeah.
I actually can't hear anything. Oh, here we go.
Oh, we were just going like, yeah.
Yeah.
We're all nodding sagely and hoping somebody else will speak.
Yeah, like I think kind of these days we want it to be a bit more general, but in the media it just kind of isn't. It's still very
I agree with you. I mean, I kind of think of queer coding as anything that isn't straight for me. And yeah, like you said, Flick, you know it when you see it. And I wasn't aware of this kind of definition of coding and decoding until reasonably recently. But I know I've been doing it all my life. You know, I saw a gay character on number 96 in Australia, and I knew they were gay, and I knew that I was like them to some extent. You know, but even though I had no labels, I had nothing. You know, I was too young to kind of think about it in any way intellectually, but the emotion was there from the moment I saw it.
I think
there's a difference as well in terms of like speaking about this historically, in terms of like you know, like all of the vaguely effeminate, drawling British accent villains that Disney has, versus like looking at queer coding in something like, there's a lot of good rep in cartoons lately. It's like looking at it in terms of things like Adventure Time or She-Ra, where it's like the intention is there for a different thing. Like the purpose of the queer coding is quite different in those cases.
What would you say the difference is there?
So like queer coding in terms of like associating your villains with queer stuff, because that was all you were allowed to do and the only way you're allowed to represent it after the Hays Code, is like kind of meant to be that way of shortcutting that association into like the reader or watcher's mind of like, oh, this person is up to no good. When in fact, what it actually did is just made whole generations of queer people going, oh, this villain is hot. This is the one I can relate to. Versus then there's like queer coding that's more like subtext, which is what you get when maybe people are doing it intentionally, but like have to slide it past like censorship in their network or whatnot, which just feels much more benign, right? Like that's much more about representation rather than villainization, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I think now we also have we've got these sort of added layers to queer coding in the way that when you adapt something, you might change a character from being canonically straight to becoming a queer character, or as it more often happens, unfortunately, going the other way and taking a character who was queer and making them straight.
Yeah.
What do you think about that sort of shift? I mean, I would assume in the room that we'd all be very happy with queer washing, which is what it's called, where you take a straight character and make them queer. But how do you feel about the other side of things, the straight washing? Andi, did you want to kick us off?
I mean, I think sometimes it's been a necessity, but that doesn't. And I think often people have got queer characters into books, into movies, just by being able to do that. I was thinking back to, okay, what are the first queer characters I remember? And I was thinking it's North Stretfield's ballet shoes, which is pre-World War II, and the children are in part educated by these two doctors that live together. And I remember, you know, I probably read that when I was about 7. I was like, interesting, you can do that. That's like a life you can have. And I wouldn't have necessarily thought, oh, they were queer. In fact, that yes, they were, and so was the author, which I didn't know at the time. So I think, while obviously I'd rather have overt representation, it's definitely better to have that coded or more subtle representation than to have nothing at all.
I think what Rem was, what Rem was saying about coding villains, though, I don't want to see that representation. Like, you know, when I was a kid, that pretty much was everything we were seeing and anything we were reading. And yeah, that annoys me. But obviously, I want to see representation as accurate and not stereotypical and not biased towards the negative stereotypes that you know are still in our society today. And I still am not getting enough of that on television or in books, basically, to be frank. But I mean, that's the time we live in, and I can see how it will be better in the future. Like, and you know, everybody in this panel is writing in these genres that really allow us to more freedom to represent in ways that are positive and not negatively stereotyped.
Yeah, and I agree. I definitely think that there's a shift. There's been a shift for many, many years, and representation is changing a lot, and we're getting a lot more of it, and it is more overt, and not so much on the subtext side. But I think you're right that it's a sort of slow process, and there are sort of levels of what straight society is comfortable with. And at the moment, they're very comfortable with gay men and lesbians and to some extent bisexual people, but trans and non-binary and some of the things that are relatively new to straight people are not coming through as much on in popular culture, I would say. I just was wondering, we've talked very briefly about how to code in a general way. Andi, do you have any insight as to how you would code a non-binary without actually saying that they're one of those things?
Yeah, this is interesting because looking at that historical coding and the villains and so on, I think a lot of how it worked was by defying gender norms or expressing particularly femininity, particularly overtly male characters expressing femininity. The sometimes drag, Ursula, who I think we'll talk about later, was based on a drag queen. And it makes me think about how sort of modern Western thinking kind of separates out sexuality and gender, but it hasn't historically been the case, and it's also not the case in many non-Western societies. So early on in the 20th century, you had the idea of the invert, and that women who were attracted to women were part male and vice versa. So I don't quite have a full analysis of how that works, but I think even when we say these characters were gay coded, I think there was a lot of trans related coding going on. I'm also thinking more recently, when there were trans people in the media, and I'm particularly thinking sort of news media or non-fiction drama, non-fiction media. It's very lurid. It's very. I mean, there were questions about genitals. There's that whole trans women putting on lipstick in the mirror whenever they're featured. There's using dead names, and I think some of us trans writers, we're going back to almost coded presentations, not because we're scared or we're not allowed to, but because privacy and dignity. And I mean, I like my characters to say, hey, I'm trans, that's cool, but maybe we don't want to talk about genitals, maybe we don't want to talk about surgery and medicalization. My characters I don't know my characters' their names. If there's a reason I have to write them, then yes, maybe I will, but I don't sit there with a character chart and give them dead names because it's not my so
I'm right there. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, I think there's maybe a positive approach that isn't so much about shame or about fear, but just about privacy and just what's important in our lives, which maybe isn't always our gender.
Yeah, I agree. And it's about showing trans people without explaining the entirety of trans history with every trans character.
Yeah.
And showing a variety of trans ways to be trans as well, because just you were mentioning, like, you see the trans woman like putting on the lipstick in the mirror. Not every trans woman wants to be hyper femme, you know. What about like the butch trans women, you know, or like, you know, trans men who don't want to be like hyper mask? Like, you know, I think it's good to see more and wider variation.
Yeah, it's very exciting to see the breadth of representation that we have ahead of us. It's very exciting. I think it would be good to maybe talk a little bit about science fiction and LGBTQ plus representation in science fiction. Obviously, from the name, you know that science fiction hasn't been around as long as some of the other genres like fantasy and horror, which we will talk about a little bit later. But when you talk about science fiction, what's, say, one really pivotal moment or an author or character who really stood out to you as being queer and showing you that that sort of representation could exist in science fiction. Flick?
In science fiction, I'm going to say the Becky Chambers' Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, partially because I've just been reading that series. But in the first book, you get a romance between two ladies. Well, one human lady and an alien. I don't want to spoil it for anyone because you should go and read it. It's amazing if you haven't. But yeah, like I don't think that was necessarily like my first introduction to queer women or queer anyone in sci-fi. I think it's probably just my favorite.
The one that stood out to you.
Yeah, the one that's kind of stood out the most. Yeah.
What about you, Rem?
See, I never think of myself as reading as much sci-fi as I do like fantasy and other genres, but then I do end up reading a lot of it. I think it was actually the exact same for me. Like I read Long Way to a Small Angry Planet and went like, oh, this is great. And then I just saw like a small thing in the author's note and I was like, oh, the author is like me in some way, is like, oh, that's so exciting. But like the moment I would have had a bit before that, even though this isn't like necessarily a queer author, I have no idea, but stereotypically reading The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin and just going, oh, you can do that, and oh, I can be here, and just like feeling very seen in that very invented world. And then a little bit more recently, Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice series doing very similar things in terms of very, very speculative gender and different ways of looking at gender. And like, I know a lot of people are like, probably like don't necessarily interpret the characters in books like Ancillary Justice as all being non-binary, but they're all non-binary. You can't do anything about it. That's just how it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are.
How about you, JL?
Yeah.
Did you have a standout moment?
Yes, I have one seminal novel which I think of as really the first time that I started really thinking about different genders in characters, and that is Tanith Lee's Drinking Sapphire Wine, or I think in America it's called Don't Bite the Sun. And it's these young people in this book who they're free to choose whatever body they want, and many of them will choose gendered bodies, but the main character, it's kind of not clear what gender they are. And her group, she is notionally badged as she, but the character's group of friends are all kind of really subversive in this group, and they are forever choosing bodies with wings and bodies with different genitalia and bodies that just do things that bodies don't do in the real world. And it just like really slapped me in the face as kind of, oh, hang on, there is a way of actually writing characters which are still human according to this world, but their technology allows them to be whatever they want to be and not what their progenitors or anybody else says they should be. And at a certain point they have to transition into that adult life and make a single decision, and the main character is kind of really, really grapples with that because they're not ready to do it. And there was so many things in that for me that were just so resonant for me as a kind of young adult, kind of 18, 19-year-old, that when I read that I just, wow, that it blew me away.
That's a really good allegory, I suppose, or not really an allegory, but an example of trans representation, in my opinion, which we were talking about before. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And a lot of those bodies kind of didn't have genitals at all. So there was non-binary stuff in there as well for me. And that author doesn't appear to be in anything other than cis heteronormative, and I have no idea whether that author intended that message, but that's that's what I got. Intentional coding or not, that's what I walked away with.
Well, that's the beauty of subtext. You know, you can often see whatever you want, wherever you want to see it. Andi, did you have anything you'd like to show as an example?
Yeah, I think my sort of lightning bulb moment was also not necessarily a queer book or a queer author, but it was John Wyndham's The Chrysalids,
Yes.
which was the group of children in a religious fundamentalist society, and they grow to realize there's something different about them, and they need to escape, and they not subtle.
Yeah.
I think there's so many good books recently. It's really exciting. I think one that stands out for me is Nino Cipri's Finna, and there's a sequel, Defect, which is it's about queer precarious workers in what's totally not IKEA, and wormholes start opening up. And it really uses all the science fiction. I've got an article about it coming out, actually, all the science fiction elements really well to illustrate that sort of queer millennial precarious worker experience. And I liked it.
I'm going to look
That's
that up,
fantastic.
Andy.
It's good.
Yeah, I've got to look up a lot of books after this. Hopefully everyone will.
We're just
Be
getting
writing them
started.
down.
Yeah.
Has anyone got a list?
These are all like fantastic examples of representation. I suppose for me, the question is, how do we keep the balance between overt representation and the sort of subtext of queer life, of the queer experience? I mean, to use a very broad popular culture example, in the X-Men, it's widely seen as an allegory for race relations in the US, but it's also got another reading as being a representation of the queer experience, where the kids usually don't know they're a mutant until they're a teenager, and then they invariably get kicked out of home and they have to go to a place that's a safe space for people like them. That sort of subtext and that experience is something that's unfortunately very common with a lot of queer kids. Do you think we're going to lose something by not having that as a subtext anymore and only having this sort of overt representation? What do you think about those two things existing together? JL, you look pensive. Oh, sorry, Andi. Would you like to go?
I was just going to say yes, but we're going to gain a lot more. I think some amazing literature comes out of oppression, comes out of difficult circumstances, but when we look at that, you can't help but think, but what else did we not get to read? What else was not written? So yes, but I'm okay with that.
I wouldn't mourn the loss, actually. Like, I think it sounds controversial, but the reason I say that is because every reader will come to a text and read subtext where they need it to, in some respects. Like, I was reading subtext all over the place that was not intentional, and I find as an author that I can't predict how anybody's going to read my work, and so I don't think that subtext will ever be lost, no matter how we progress and how we code and how we intentionally portray characters. There will always be subtext. So sometimes, unless we do a really deep, narratological analysis of every single thing we write, we're not going to be able to see that, but other people will. And 10, 15 years in the future, whatever the thing is, the social thing is that a growing up kid needs to get affirmation on, they might see it when we never even knew about it. So I don't think it actually ever can be lost, even if we are trying to subvert it.
That actually ties into what Andi and JL have been saying. It ties into something that you've mentioned, JL, about wanting to remove the straightwashing of historical representation and historical stories. How do you think that would benefit? Good
question. I think I've actually just done a reasonable amount of kind of narratological analysis of a few stories that are kind of painted as feminist or painted as kind of iconically about difference and coming of age, the YA novels. Shall I name names?
Yes, by all means.
Yeah, so I did a narratological analysis of Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book, and
Nice.
also Margot Lanigan's Sea Hearts. And I noticed that both of those novels have characters in them that are witches. And I looked at like both of these novels have been painted by reviewers as really kind of coming of age novels, really positive stereotyping for gender roles and all sorts of things. And I looked at it and went, okay, but every witch, the witches in both these books are all kind of nasty, wizened, fat. I don't know how you can be fat and wizened at the same time, but they manage it. They're just kind of they're definitely kind of ridiculing or marginalizing gender non-conforming people with these witch stereotypes. And I kind of was really thinking about what readers bring, what a generic or the idea of an implied reader brings to a text, and how they read the text and come to that text with specific knowledge about what things mean that they don't even think about when they read. And so, those authors maybe didn't intend for those witches to be problematic characters but that's how I read them, because I kind of historically know about how witches are often gender non-conforming, and they've got all these contrary kind of indicators and coding, like being femme fatales, but also being kind of not, wizened crones who are, past their use by date kind of. There's all these stereotypes that I really kind of don't want to write those sort of characters. And I think understanding, as I think probably every queer person does, about how negative stereotypes affect them, I really try in my writing to subvert that. But I'm always worried that anybody's going to come to that reading and bring something else different, and they're going to see something different. And I'm worried that I can't control that. And yet also that is the joy and the beauty of writing these characters. What
Yeah, it really is a
Andy
double-edged
was
sword.
saying, yeah, that's right. What Andy was saying before about their character, they don't know their dead name. I have a series of books where it starts with the character has that dead name, and by the end of the series, they've gone along that journey of working out that actually they're non-binary, or without ever using that label, because it's in my steampunk world that label kind of wouldn't exist. But it actually shocked me when I got to the end of the novel and I realized what I'd been writing about for the last 3 novellas. I'm like, oh, whoops. Okay, let's go with it. This is what the character wants to do.
Oh yeah.
That's amazing.
I don't know if I answered your question, but there you go.
I think so. It was very interesting. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, Rem. Earlier you mentioned Anne Leckie's books, the Ancillary Justice series, and rather pointedly said that you believed everyone in that book was non-binary. And you've said of your own novel that nobody in it is straight. Do you think this is where we're headed? A non-straight representation in future?
Okay, technically no, but like it was an accident with my book with Fox Hunt. Like I wanted to have a majority queer cast because I wanted you know, it's set in a future world, and I wanted to have a future where we all make it and that kind of thing. And also because representation in the media is important to me. And I didn't realize until quite a bit later that I'd accidentally not put any straight people in. I hadn't put in any like cishet people in the whole book. I don't even have a supporting straight character. I don't have any token straights. I don't think that everyone needs to be doing this by any means, but I do think that if queer authors want to be running around filling our books with like majority queer casts and writing about bi people and gay people and trans people and ace people and arrow people and every type of person that there is, then like we could do that for like several decades and it still wouldn't weigh out the amount of times we haven't been allowed to do that or the amount of times we've been removed or sidelined. So I think, you know, I don't think it's going to be the be-all and end-all of fiction. I think there will be some books like that, and then some books where people forget that queerness is an option, and then most books will have a decent mix of a variety of characters, and I think that that is neat.
Definitely. Yeah.
And we move in packs. We build communities. Like it's what people think that we just hang out on the edge of a group of straight folks. I'm sure there are people like that, but
I do.
This is realistic world.
It's true. I mean, it's the found family experience, I suppose. I mean, where there is one queer person, there is bound to be another very close by.
Multiply.
Pretty much.
One of the things that reminds me of is fan fiction. And when we're talking about all of this, you know, literature and films and things that have no queer representation in them, one way to get it in there, even if it's not in canon, is to write fan fiction. And that's where someone might write their own story based on characters from Harry Potter, for example. And there are a couple of sort of raunchier versions of fan fiction. There's slash fiction where you take two male characters and put them together, and fem slash where you take two female characters and put them together. Just quickly, Flick, maybe you want to talk to us a little bit about, not to single you out,
no, that's
not that there's anything
fine.
wrong with slash and fem slash. I've done my fair share of it. What do you think about those options?
It's actually funny that you asked me that, because I think like fan fiction was probably one of my first kind of forays into being queer, being trans, being gay, being lesbian, like any of that. Through slash fiction, like, you know, you kind of get like it's this weird dichotomy of like specifically like slash fiction. It's this weird thing of like it can be incredibly like voyeuristic and fetishistic and kind of dehumanizing to gay men, but kind of on the other hand as well, I think that kind of thing gives a lot of people a way to explore their sexuality and other sexualities. And I'm just kind of remembering like one of the first kind of really trans stories that I read was actually some Harry Potter fan fiction, which was, what's his name? Remus Lupin, who's the werewolf. And, you know, I think like being a werewolf is often like a symbol of transness almost sometimes. And so it was, I think a lot of people kind of like took that and ran with it, which is why it was just kind of almost a little bit funny when J.K. Rowling just came out as like a huge turf, because it's just like, there's all this fan fiction though, like you just got to deal with that apparently now. So it's kind of like that kind of sick joy.
I think you call that poetic justice.
Yes, yeah, definitely. But yeah, so I think fan fiction can be a really good way for people to explore, their sexuality in a safe space as well, because it's a very welcoming community. I've always thought, and you know, might not be able to get that anywhere else. So,
and it has the potential to affect the things that it's being written about in some cases. There are two examples that spring to mind, but please jump in if you have others or better ones. One is Supernatural, which I think there was a lot of slash fiction written about many of the different characters. And then it sort of got written in close to the end with one of the main characters and an angel, but it was done in such a brief and sort of violent and sort of disrespectful way that it actually earned the ire of the fans. And then the other side is just going back a few years, Xena Warrior Princess, which was something that I grew up on.
Yeah.
Yes. Should we just have a whole panel talking about Xena? Yeah.
I'm there.
Yeah. And those
Absolutely.
sort of fan fictions, they helped guide the storyline in Xena to make Xena and Gabrielle into a real relationship, which is really fantastic. Are there any other examples?
Except that they died immediately. They died immediately after, just so we can bring the bury your gays trope into that.
That is troubling. The bury your gays trope. Should we talk a little bit about that? Do you want to explain what it is, JL, since you brought it up? Sounds like I'm a teacher telling you off. But...
Well, no. Hang on, just let me get my notes. So essentially it's in film or television or writing that trope of if a character is overtly gay and something good is happening with them, they almost invariably are killed off. I was reading something earlier today about how Orange is the New Black was kind of being celebrated as representational of queer people, but the trans character in that does get killed off, and I stopped watching it. I'm sorry if I've just let out the cat out of the bag, but it is some years old now.
We stopped watching.
Stopped
watching before that.
I had to stop watching. Like, I was a little bit iffy by that stage, but when the trans character was killed off, I just couldn't deal. I couldn't deal. God, that was the most heinous example of bury your gays that I had seen for quite some time, or in this case, bury your trans.
It's almost it's just another obstacle to come up against as we talk about getting rid of queer coding and decoding it and making it into the text or the forefront of these stories, only to come up against bury your gays, which will just kill them left, right, and center as soon as they come out. It's very troubling.
I think, though, there's also a way that's been used against queer creators, and what was quite a specific trope has, which was to do with you find happiness and then you die, and that's the only queer rep that dies, has been really used against any queer creator that writes anything negative, pretty much, and particularly anyone dying, and has become a policing thing. And I think people can write that really well. I think there are some very emotionally deep recreations. I also think there's some, like Alison Evans, who's a Melbourne author, has written a zombie novel called Highway Bodies, and it's about queer trans teens surviving the zombie apocalypse. And of course some of them die because it's a zombie apocalypse, but there's also a solid group that survive, and it's quite affirming of that survival. So I think there can be really good examples that don't fall into that, almost always by queer people.
Yeah, but I mean, is that the key, Andi, that you've got to have so many, like Rem was saying, no straight characters? You've got to have books like ours that basically, queer wash in order to not depict any straight people at all, to be able to kill some characters off but still retain other characters that are so that your audience is not getting thrown under a bus.
Not necessarily, though. I think that's one way of avoiding it. I think what's key to me, with Bury Your Gaze, is it shows that as the inevitable consequence of happiness. So it's a cosmic punishment. It's almost a religious punishment. I think that's
I think that's how it started.
Sorry.
Actually, so,
Well,
sorry,
yeah,
I was
if
just going to
it's
say,
part of the
religious
Hays
punishment
Code,
didn't
yeah.
start as, yeah,
Yeah.
it was literal punishment for basically being gay.
And when they're the only representation in a piece, that's when it really will cut at you. Whereas if there is more than one or a whole group of queer people, then it can be more easily understood. I mean, it's the same as what sort of besets women in a lot of popular culture. There's the concept of fridging, where a woman dies so that a man can feel. Just really
Move the plot along.
generalize it. Yeah,
Yes,
I mean that.
Yeah. Feel empathy.
And
I
once
refer back to Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book in that respect too.
it's very prevalent and something we need to avoid. But something for another panel.
Yes.
To look a little bit more deeply into genre fiction, let's shift over to horror, moving away from science fiction. Flick's getting excited.
It's my baby.
Horror is a very old genre, I suppose. I mean, I imagine they were telling horror stories, around the fires, in the Stone Age, in their own ways. It's always been a way to control, to keep children from doing things that you don't want them to be doing, and it's really come into the, I suppose, monsters and characters and people from centuries and centuries ago are still in the mainstream and popular now. I'm talking about like Dracula, for example, and werewolves, which we talked about before. In my opinion, I think horror is just rife with queer representation and content. It may be subtextual in a lot of ways, but I also think a lot of the creators and people working in horror are queer as well. So, I mean, the most famous one that comes to mind is Bram Stoker, who obviously has not come out because he wasn't alive at a time when that would happen. But historically, people believe that he was gay. And he invented, I'm not sure if that's the right way of putting it. He created Dracula, which is, a seminal piece. So, Flick, do you think horror is inherently queer?
I do, and I also want to kind of like just put that thing out there with horror that like I think with horror there can be a very big difference between like queer in how like it gets looked at in academic spaces as being something separate. Like the idea of the queer in that respect is that it can never be assimilated, because once something becomes assimilated, it's no longer queer. And I think that ties in very well with the idea of the abject and the other, which you get pretty much all the time in horror. There's so many different works on it, I couldn't possibly go into it. And so I think that kind of the fear of the otherness that gets talked about in literally every horror film, book, TV show, is a perfect site for queer as in LGBT, but also anyone who's been othered. So like people of color, trans people, gay people, lesbians, intersex people. I think it's really good for non-binary people, because I think, like, I personally think that a lot of, we talked about it earlier with a lot of like the representation is kind of the gay man and the lesbian woman. I think there's not. I think people don't kind of like to sit in that kind of in-between space that a lot of trans people, a lot of non-binary, intersex people tend to occupy. And I think that horror is very good for kind of getting into those really kind of uncomfortable zones, because it's trying to make you uncomfortable, but then it can kind of make you think, well, why am I uncomfortable? And what about this makes me uncomfortable? And yeah, and also sometimes it's good to just like, there's this thing of like, oh, it's like, yes, it's bad to paint like trans people as and gay people as scary and bad, but like there's also this part that's like really quite empowering. I think, and like I always think of that one scene in Silence of the Lambs where Buffalo Bill is like kind of like dancing around his room, and he kind of like holds himself up like this beautiful butterfly. And I just remember the first time I saw that, I was like, he's beautiful. Like this is I like, it's majestic. It's wonderful. And I like, to me, like that's queer joy almost. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though.
You go, JL.
I was going to say, even though that portrayal was problematic in so many other ways, I'm absolutely with you there. But yeah, and I think reclaiming that language around being monstrous, I'm seeing that happen more and more in trans and non-binary kind of discussion groups, and I think every one of us has something like that in our bio. Even we're not afraid of that idea of monstrous, you know.
You're not wrong.
And that ties back to what Rem mentioned very early on. We were going to talk about villainy and queer villainy, and obviously that stems, I would say, from horror and from, you know, the sexy, alluring vampires, from werewolves transforming their bodies, you know, and those sort of things. And then if you look at Ursula, let's talk about her. From The Little Mermaid, the character design is based on Divine, one of the most well-known drag queens in the world. She's very camp. She's larger than life. She's just spectacular. I mean, I personally am always rooting for Ursula to win whatever she's trying to win. I would agree with you. I don't see queer villainy, even though it may be meant in a negative way. I don't take it that way.
The villains are always just more interesting, I think.
They are. Yeah.
It's a bit more complex, and yeah.
And I suppose another example of that is the Babadook, that Australian film. Is it Australian?
Yeah, I think it is. I've never actually seen it.
Yeah.
I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, so the monster in the Babadook, or the Babadook and himself, is a gay icon without ever being coded that way, without appearing that way in any way. It's just embraced by the queer community. So there's obviously a larger general affinity that we have to that outsider, that monster, that sort of idea. Not to say that we're monsters, because we're not. We're just normal people. But we are a little bit, you know, better than everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. Sharper teeth, all of that.
Totally think queer is a superpower in its own right, I reckon.
Definitely. So we've only got a little bit more time left. So I thought we'd just maybe loop back around to queer coding in general. We've covered quite a lot of ground and given everybody a lot of reading homework. Fantastic. So let's just maybe talk about where we see queer coding in the future, what the roadmap is for you. And did you want to let us know what you think?
I mean, I think we can move on from queer coding as something to hide and look at it as something that's multifaceted. Like, we can have both overt queerness, but we can also have different ways of understanding queerness. And that's, I mean, I mentioned Finna earlier. It's science fiction and fantasy often come with things that are both literal and non-literal all at the same time, and I think that's what I'm looking forward to seeing. I also think more representation of the letters further along the acronym. So, you know, more representation, more intersex representation where our culturally specific genders and identities, and I hope that's going to come through.
Yeah, it's stuff that's less sanitized for cis het. I think like I want to see like like it almost feels like everyone has to be really pretty to be represented. Like you never, like it kind of mentioned earlier, like you only get like the hyper femme like trans women, the quite mask trans men. Like I want to see someone like mid transition, like they're having a good time but they're also kind of having a bad time. Like I want to just see like some of the almost uglier sides, I guess of being queer without like the being beaten up part of it. I want to see like the awkwardness that like you can get. I just want to see like some of that.
You want to see the non-binary sides of it.
Yeah.
I definitely want to see. I definitely want to see the later letters represented. I almost, this again might be controversial, but I almost think that gay and lesbian portrayals now are almost normalized. Like cishet people don't really seem to react terribly poorly. They're not stunned to see those characters on television or in fiction anymore. But I think we've still got quite a long way to go with the other letters. And unlike you, Flick, I want to see just absolute celebration of those superpowers, like just not the messy side, but the joyful side of finding oneself and being able to live one's best life as a whole person, and not just as I'm trans and that's all that identifies me, or I'm non-binary and that's all that, everything I do has to be related to that, because that's just not how reality works. And I hope that in the future we're seeing that more in more mainstream fictional depictions, even though I think genre fiction and sci-fi has really been the vanguard of that. I want to see that become the old guard, and for us to be just represented in everything all the time. Rem, what about you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with all of that. I think like I want all of it. Like I want the messy and I want the bright and the heroic. I definitely do want the messy because I love just writing, my trans characters and my non-binary characters who are queer as hell, but also just terrible people or very flawed and dealing with the repercussions of those flaws. But I think what's so exciting and what's so radiant about this period of time in speculative fiction and across several genres and mediums is just that we get to have more of it. So we get more of this breadth of experience. So we get to see more of those different kinds of stories and like things that focus in on like these different things and queer stories that disagree and that come from different places. And we get to see all of those. And I'm really excited about it.
Me too.
Yeah, there's a lot to look forward to. There's a lot to be happy about that we've seen in the past, even the representation that's been, not as glowing and not as positive. It's definitely something that we can learn from and something that we can grow from. And I think all of these futures sound fantastic. I mean, personally, I'm with you, Rem. Let's just have all the characters be queer forevermore. It works for me. It should work for everyone. That is all we've got time for today. But thank you all so much for joining me and talking about queer coding and queer decoding. I have had a wonderful time and I've learned a huge amount, so I'm very grateful to you all. So thank you.